Are we headed for another Great Depression? It's a question that many people are asking as they look at the state of the global economy today. And while the circumstances are different, there are striking similarities between the economic conditions of the 1930s and today. In this video, we'll explore some of the key parallels between the Great Depression and today's economy, and what we can learn from them. So sit tight and get ready to take a deep dive into the past and present of the world's economy. Hey there everyone, welcome to this video on the similarities between the Great Depression and today's economy. You may have heard of the Great Depression, but did you know that there are striking similarities between the economic situations then and now?
Today, I must tell you that in spite of all our victories, a rough road lies ahead. What a shame it would be, and what a folly, to add to our load the bitter quarrel with which the extreme socialists are eager to convulse and exploit these critical years.
Recent economic reports have some economists drawing parallels to the days before the Great Depression.
GDP reveals ominous Great Depression warning sign not seen since 1932.
The country is facing the worst economy since the Great Depression.
Well, do you think that we're headed into a global depression?
So, you might be asking yourself, what was the Great Depression? Well, to put it simply, during the Roaring '20s, people were enjoying their wealth and a booming economy, just like we have seen in recent times. But what happened when the bubble burst? The stock market became overvalued, which created an artificial bull run. However, when people realized there was no real value in the stocks or businesses they were buying, a frantic mass selling of stocks took place, causing bank runs and the Great Depression. The Great Depression is one of those historical events that is very difficult to put into simple terms. Many different historians and economists link the cause to a number of contradicting factors. In this video, I'll mainly focus on the Fed's involvement, which is often overlooked. Now, before we get into it, we need to take a look at the 1920s, as this decade was a catalyst for the events of the Great Depression. Ah, yes. The 1920s, also known as the Roaring '20s, was a decade of unprecedented change and innovation. It was a time of cultural revolution, technological advancements, and economic prosperity. The decade saw a new generation of young people who were eager to break free from the old traditions and embrace a new, modern way of life. The flappers, with their short hair, shorter dresses, and rebellious attitudes, symbolized the changing times. The 1920s was also a time of artistic and cultural ferment. The Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement that celebrated African American culture and creativity, saw the rise of jazz music, literature, and visual art. The invention of the radio and the spread of mass communication brought people closer together and changed the way they consume news and entertainment. It was also a time of economic prosperity, with the stock market soaring to new heights and businesses flourishing It was a time of boundless optimism and endless opportunity. But this prosperity was short-lived. The stock market crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression, and the Roaring Twenties came to an abrupt end. Is that it? What is often forgotten is that the 1920s boom was mostly fueled by credit. And yes, many great things came out of this period, as mentioned before, but the means by which it was created and sustained lacked integrity, leaving many in debt.
1920s featured large-scale domestic consumption of relatively new consumer products, which was good for American industry, but much of this consumption was fueled by credit and installment buying, which, as it turned out, was totally unsustainable. The thing about credit is that it works fine unless and until economic uncertainty increases, at which point...
Although it is common knowledge that speculation caused the market crash, people loaning money from banks to buy stocks, that's only a small piece of the puzzle. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy and the government were also key players in this, especially the Fed from the shadows. The stock market crash of 1929 wiped out billions of dollars in wealth, causing widespread panic among investors. Overproduction and underconsumption worsened the economic downturn, resulting in a glut of goods and falling prices. The banking system was poorly regulated, and many banks were heavily invested in the stock market, which made them vulnerable to the stock market crash. As a result, many banks failed, leading to a wave of bank runs and further exacerbating the economic crisis. Protectionism was also a factor, as many countries imposed high tariffs on imported goods. Government policies such as the Federal Reserve's decision to raise interest rates in 1928 may have also contributed to the severity of the economic downturn. All in all, the Great Depression caused widespread unemployment, poverty, and hardship. The joblessness for such a stretched period of time left many without basic necessities. What made the Great Depression so bad was the joblessness for such stretched periods of time. You know how your grandparents always tell you to save money or eat as much as you can while it's still here and available? This mindset came from the Great Depression, as people genuinely didn't know where their next meal or dollar would come from. And this mindset was passed down generation to generation. A major misconception is that speculation, among other things, caused the Great Depression, with families becoming wealthy and many millionaires being born out of this period. They chose to buy stocks and invest in Wall Street, which at the time was home to many charlatans, frauds, and conmen. Sound familiar? But this is misleading, because during this time, the gap between the rich and the poor increased dramatically. Only 3% of Americans actually own stock. Sure, the rich could afford to own stocks and speculate, but this wasn't a big percentage of the population, as mainstream history would have you believe. There was another force at play, another hand guiding these events from the shadows. The Federal Reserve. The Great Depression, then, was not caused by speculation, just as much as the upcoming recession would solely be caused by speculation. And trust me, there's a lot of that going on, I know. A very key and forgotten factor in these events, then and now, was the Federal Reserve's monetary policy and poor government management that worsened the economy.
When FDR came in 1933, he then put in the National Industrial Recovery Act. He put in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He put in the Wagner Act. He issued more presidential executive orders than all subsequent presidents throughout the remainder of the 20th century. So the government intervened on a massive scale, and yet the unemployment never came down below double digits for the entire decade.
What is monetary policy? Well, there are two ways the government and the Fed work together to stimulate the economy. These two methods are known as monetary and fiscal policy. Now look, I don't want to bore you too much on how these things work, but monetary policy is dictated by the Fed and fiscal by Congress. So let's start with monetary policy. This is basically how the Federal Reserve, also known as the Fed, manages the money supply and interest rates in the economy. The goal is to keep inflation low and stable and promote growth and employment. One way the government can do this is through something called quantitative easing, which is when they buy up assets like bonds to increase the money supply and lower interest rates. On the flip side, they can also do something called quantitative tightening, which is when they sell assets and decrease the money supply to raise interest rates. Now, fiscal policy is a little different. This is how the government uses taxes and spending to influence the economy. For example, during a recession, they might increase the government spending to stimulate the economy or cut taxes to put more money in people's pockets. So back in the 1920s, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed for short, decided to pump a ton of money into the economy by lowering interest rates. This caused a lot of people to take out loans and invest in the stock market, which, as you already know, led to a huge economic boom. Fast forward to 2008 and the flu in 2020, and we see something similar. The Fed once again lowers interest rates and injects tons of money into the economy through a process called quantitative easing, or QE for short. This was done to prevent a total economic collapse. But here's the thing. Back in the Great Depression, the Fed did the exact opposite. They contracted the money supply by raising interest rates, which caused businesses to fail and unemployment to skyrocket. This turned what could have been a short recession into a decade-long depression. You might be wondering why the Fed would do something like that. Well, it's because they believed that inflation was a bigger threat than a depression. This process of expanding and contracting the money supply is known as monetary policy. When the Fed is trying to stimulate the economy, they use expansionary monetary policy, like QE. And when they're trying to control inflation, they use contractionary monetary policy, like raising interest rates. So, was the Great Depression caused by a lack of knowledge, or was it done purposefully? Well, that's up for debate. Some economists argue that the Fed simply didn't know any better, while others believe that it was a deliberate decision. It's hard to imagine a world without America's dominance. In the early 20th century, the United Kingdom was considered the world's superpower, with the largest economy and a vast empire that spanned the globe. Nobody could touch the British pound. However, as other countries began to catch up in terms of industrialization and military power, the balance of power started to shift. One of these rising powers was the United States, which had become the world's largest economy by the 1920s. But the US was still largely isolationist, and its involvement in global affairs was limited. After the events of the Great Depression and World War II, this all changed.
Somehow this historic hall of glass where the reparations conference of the 1914-18 war was held, is a delicate place for the verbal brickbats which many expect to be tossed about during the conference.
Something that's worth briefly mentioning is how the US made bank during World War I by selling weapons to both sides. Yeah, you heard me right. The US was supplying weapons to the Allies and the Central Powers, which helped them keep their economies booming while Europe was at war. The US was profiting from this conflict while staying neutral. But it wasn't just the economy that benefited. The US became a major financial power during this time, lending huge sums of money to both sides of the war. So, the US managed to keep its hands clean while making a killing financially. It's a little known fact, but just another example of how money and politics have always been intertwined. Now, you couple that with the consolidation of power after World War II, and you get the global hegemony we have today. But that's a video for another day.
Okay then.
One thing is for certain though, there are eerie similarities between the 1920s and post-2008. These similarities are hard to ignore. Something both these periods have in common were low interest rates. And this encouraged businesses and individuals to take out loans on credit, leading to a boom in innovation and production. The 1920s brought us the radio and car, among other things, while post-2008 saw the rise of tech companies. Again, although these innovations are great and beneficial, they were built by means which lacked integrity. And, as always, there's a dark side to prosperity. The 1920s and post-2008 both saw a rise in demand for social change and tensions between rising powers and nations. Now, we've seen the Black Swan event of which highlighted the global economy's vulnerability and reliance on the Fed's monetary policy. In just a few months, the Fed printed 40% of all cash in history, creating an everything bubble. Just like the 20s, this bubble needs to burst, and we've seen early signs of it already. It's crucial to understand that the Great Depression wasn't solely caused by the factors mentioned earlier. The joblessness of the common folk, paired with the Fed's contraction of the money supply, was the primary cause of the Depression. However, something that must be stated though, is that the circumstances are a little different than before. What do you think? Is the next global depression imminent? It's almost been 100 years since these events took place, and any economist will tell you that the economy is cyclical in nature. Whether it's a recession every decade or a depression every century, history doesn't repeat itself. But it certainly rhymes.
Kick around, wear a suit to breakfast, underwear that laces up. All girls have a guy's haircut. Crank your car to make it start. You will die of